Good enough. I'll go ahead and start. Okay, welcome to Business, Legitimate and Illegitimate in Louisiana and the South, the third of 6 online sessions that are part of the 2023 LHA program. I am Brady Banta, retired archivist and historian residing in Jonesboro, Arkansas. I shall introduce this afternoon's presenters, monitor the questions and comments that you may post throughout the session using the chat function, and make some brief comments before the discussion that will conclude the session. This afternoon, we will hear presentations by Dexter Babin II and Michael D. Wynne. Unfortunately, Charles Westmoreland had to withdraw from the session. Dexter Babin II has been involved in public history for 9 years, and for the past 3 years has been the director and curator of the Regional Military Museum in Houma, Louisiana. He received the BA in History in 2012 from the University of New Orleans and is completing an MA in History at Louisiana Tech University. Today's presentation, Mobster Emeritus, Carlos Marcello and the Imagery in the Imaginary Structures of Organized Crime in New Orleans, 1950 to 1985, draws upon his thesis research. And we'll now go ahead and turn it over to Dexter and let him make his presentation.
Thank you. La Costa Nostra has evolved into, over these 8 decades, highly structured families. The hierarchies of these families in New York, Newark, Cleveland, Boston, Kansas City, St. Louis, Milwaukee, New Orleans, and Denver have been decimated by convictions and incarcerations for long term. Testifying before the 1988 U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittees on Investigations, FBI Director William S. Sessions' opening statement showcased the Bureau's recent success in dismantling organized crime. The result of the Bureau's efforts were exhibited in the subcommittee's final report, which included membership charts of mafia organizations across the United States. Beginning with the infamous 5 families of New York, mafia boss John Gotti sat on top of an extended outline of identified members who made up the skeleton of the Gambino crime family. Despite being described by Director Sessions as highly structured, the New Orleans hierarchy only included one name, reputed mafia boss Carlos Marcello. So small was this quote-unquote chart that it shared a page with the mafia hierarchy of Tampa, Florida, and St. Louis, Missouri. First outlined in the 1963 testimony of mafia turncoat Joseph Valachi, law enforcement was led to believe that a mafia organization or family was highly structured and bureaucratic. A boss sits atop of a long pyramid with an underboss directly under him, while a series of capo regimes or capos are in charge of a crew of soldiers. Soldiers, in turn, are responsible for handling associates, those who work for the family but are not members or made men. This structure of organized crime, popularly referred to as the Cressy model after sociologist Donald Cressy, has long been the government's position on the structure of organized crime in the United States. The problem with subscribing to this structure is the 1988 subcommittee meeting. If all of organized crime was universally framed, why did the government outline a more extensive membership chart for some families while barely nothing for others? Could that have been the difference in investigative efforts? Unlikely, since New Orleans was one of the many stops that Senator Estes Kefauver made during his 1950 investigation into organized crime. The end result in its structure only produced one name, Carlos Marcello. Could Marcello have been such an insulated criminal mastermind that a structural indictment of his organization proved impossible for the FBI to detect? This scenario is also unlikely due to declassified testimony from suspected members of the quote-unquote mafia in New Orleans, portraying any kind of criminal group as unorganized and overly reliant on illegal gambling. The problem proposed by this paper is in the conformity of investigation in which the FBI approached organized crime. Instead of treating every city's crime family as regionally unique, the Bureau instead approached all criminal organizations as possessing the same structure. This paper seeks to understand the lack of success when it came to prosecuting organized crime in New Orleans as an organization. Using primary sources declassified by the FBI, this work will demonstrate how the Bureau's efforts in obtaining a structural indictment of any criminal organization in New Orleans was hampered by an inescapable belief in the Cressy structure. First identified as the manager of the Marcello Wire Service by the 1959 McClellan Committee, alleged New Orleans Mafia member Joseph Pareto was interviewed about his involvement with illegal gambling on June 15, 1962. Pareto told agents that he was the manager of Nola News Company, which was controlled by a partnership of Pareto, Joseph Marcello, Anthony Carolla, son of Sylvester Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, the late Joseph Peccaro, and alleged Chicago mobster Ralph Emery. Nola News Company served as a prominent wire service which, quote, disseminated racehorse results in Louisiana, East Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Alabama to bookmakers and gamblers. On April 4th, 1961, an April 4th, 1961 criminal intelligence memo documented that Pareto met with Oni the Killer Madden, the top hoodlum of Hot Springs, Arkansas. In the same memo, Madden openly admitted to agents that he was receiving race results through telephone from New Orleans, running him a $1,600 a month phone bill. That was until September 13th, 1961, when Congress adopted Public Law 87-216, which made it a federal crime for the use of wire communication facilities for interstate transmission of wagering information by persons engaged in the business of betting or wagering. When his FBI interview occurred less than a year after Public Law 87-216 passed, Pareto told federal agents that Nola News Company had quit broadcasting horse race results outside of Louisiana. While it is arguable that Pareto could have lied to agents about the closure of the interstate wire service, his testimony is corroborated by former News Nola Company employee Abel Chauvin, who was fired after over 10 years of employment as an electrician because of the dismantling of the wire. FBI agents in Hot Springs also reported the shutdown of the wire after September of 1961. Pareto's interview not only revealed the ominous future for Nola News Company, but also for organized crime in New Orleans. When Pareto spoke to agents about a rumor that New York mobster Lawrence Larry Gallo, older brother of Crazy Joe Gallo, was coming to New Orleans to muscle in on its rackets, he told agents that there was nothing for Gallo to take over. Pareto said that the rackets in New Orleans are gone with the exception of a few old-time bookies that are trying to keep from going broke. While agents attempted to groom Pareto for the FBI's top echelon criminal informant program, the Bureau abandoned the effort when he became less interested in conducting interviews. One of the last things that Pareto told agents was that he was thinking about getting into real estate. While brief, Pareto's testimony revealed how the criminal economy of New Orleans, quote-unquote, organized underworld, overly depended on illegal gambling. If Pareto was a member of a monolithic criminal organization, surely another role could have been found for him. With no such organization in New Orleans, Pareto's industry was destroyed by the government, leaving him with his only source of employment, a restaurant that operated out of Carlos Marcello's Town and Country Motel on Airline Highway. Pareto was not the only New Orleans mobster the FBI targeted in the early to mid-1960s. In 1965, frustrated due to the Bureau's inability to, quote, develop information concerning the existence of La Costa Nostra in New Orleans or Louisiana through live informants, the FBI decided to bug gambling figure Nofio Pecora. Being the first technical coverage of a suspected New Orleans mafia member, the Bureau placed a radio device inside the lamp in Pecora's office in the Tropical Tourist Court, located on Chef Menteur Highway. According to the Bureau, Pecor's office was a known hoodlum hangout of suspected New Orleans Mafia member Joseph Pareto and Dixie Mafia members Thomas Amato and Lester Jimmy James. The FBI hoped it could record conversations between Pecora and different members of organized crime in New Orleans to develop him into a high echelon informant. The Bureau was confident enough in its measures that Pecora was assigned the symbol name of 12-83PC to protect his identity. Unfortunately for the FBI, technical troubles plagued the undercover operation. Before agents could break into Pecor's office undetected to fix the problem, Hurricane Betsy hit New Orleans on August 27, 1965. Not only was the tropical tourist court destroyed, but also the FBI's bug. Declassified documents revealed that agents' fears of the bug being discovered were calmed when Pecor decided to demolish the tropical tourist court and build a shopping center in its place. The destruction brought by Hurricane Betsy did little to discourage the FBI's efforts. The Bureau's strategy pivoted from using listening devices to reverting back to live informants. During an interview, an informant told agents that, quote, an Italian criminal setup exists in the New Orleans area, but the informant had never heard of it being referred to the name of Costa Nostra. The informant also told agents that this group was not well organized, and that to his knowledge does not hold any regular meetings, nor has any formal initiation ever been held to take in new members. This redacted informant's detailing the disorganization of the mafia in New Orleans dismantled the idea of there being a monolithic, highly structured criminal organization. Yes, a group of Italians constantly worked together in furthering an illegal enterprise, which consisted mostly of gambling, but that didn't necessarily make them a highly structured Cosa Nostra organization. Pecora also didn't consider himself to be a member of Cosa Nostra, the mafia, or any structured criminal group. When interviewed by the FBI on April 26, 1967, Pecora told agents that, quote, La Cosa Nostra was something that was going on up north. Pecora was only familiar with the terms Black Hand and Mafia while growing up in New Orleans, referring to them as two distinct organizations. While Pecora told agents that he did work with Marcello's predecessor, Sylvester Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, in the narcotics trade, he quit associating with him soon after his first arrest in 1935. Pecora also told agents that he was friends with Carlos Marcello for over 25 years, and that Marcello, like himself, was mostly involved in real estate. A redacted source told FBI agents in 1972 that Pecora was talking about the good old days, reminiscing about the Black Hand in New Orleans and saying, quote, I never made no money with anybody living. All the guys I dealt with are dead now. The aging Pecora was unhappy with the upcoming generation of young hoodlums in the Crescent City, saying, quote, these young punks don't know nothing. Much like Pareto, the FBI's investigation into Pecora failed to garner any information that the Bureau could use intelligence-wise to build the structure of Marcello's criminal organization. Quite the opposite, there are numerous remarks in the FBI's documentation of Pecora stating that he was not currently involved with any illegal activity. While the Bureau investigated suspected mobsters to get further into Marcello's orbit, its most significant source of information concerning his daily activities was not an accused member of organized crime turned rat, but rather a simple office worker. Between October 1968 and March 1969, a source within Marcello's Town and Country Motel office reported to FBI agent John C. McCurran the day-to-day activities of Marcello. Whatever agents imagined accompanied the daily routine of a man who was accused of assassinating the president, source number 1734-PC regaled agents of behavior that was comparable to the B-plot of an episode of The Sopranos. For example, Marcello juggled two volatile girlfriends while keeping it a secret from his family. His son, Joseph Marcello, struggled to comprehend the intricacies of real estate investment, and Marcello argued over a $1,000 sewage bill with Joseph Pareto. While most information that number 1734-PC passed on to the FBI was similar in its banality, there's enough information that gives insight into Marcello's operations. While the political machine that Marcello worked with may have been a relic of the past, he was still politically connected. Often seen in his company were local officials and law enforcement, like Lafourche Parish Sheriff Eddie St. Marie, local ILA President Al Chittenden, and state representatives like Hank Lossiera. However, the limits of Marcello's political influence were also on display. When asked if Marcello had influence over Kenner Mayor Eddie DiGiuliano, the source said that DiGiuliano listened to nobody but his uncle. Other declassified documents corroborated the deterioration of Marcello's alleged political influence. In an Airtel memo dated on June 19, 1961, confidential source number 1075-C told the Bureau that Marcello, Joseph Pareto, Nofio Pecora, and mayoral candidate Victor Shiro met at the home of Anthony Bologna, a New Orleans liquor dealer. The source said that the New Orleans Italian element would support Shiro's candidacy if he replaced G.I. Giarrusso as chief of detectives. Another confidential source told the Bureau in 1967 that while Marcello is head of quote-unquote the syndicate in New Orleans, he does not exert tight control over Orleans Parish. If the information extracted from these redacted sources were genuine, and given that Giarrusso remained in his position through Shiro's administration, it proved the limitations of Marcello's influence as a supposed political power broker. Despite the intelligence that suggested Marcello was more of a semi-legitimate real estate speculator than traditional mafia boss, the Bureau spent the next 20 years trying to prove otherwise. The last major Bureau operation against Marcello was the 1985 Camtex, which stood for Carlos Marcello, Texas, investigation. Already incarcerated in a maximum security prison for the 1981 Bry Lab undercover sting, the FBI suspected that Marcello was still able to operate his criminal network from inside prison. The primary goal of Camtex was to, quote, identify the hierarchy and criminal activities of the New Orleans La Costa Nostra family and secure a criminal enterprise prosecution, similar to what the FBI was doing to the 5 families in New York. The FBI admitted its failure in intelligence gathering on the structure of organized crime in New Orleans as a historic problem in dismantling the organization. Ultimately, the Camtex operation was a failure. Not only was the FBI still unable to chart the structure of organized crime in New Orleans, but released documents revealed that, quote, the objective of this undercover operation was to investigate alleged organized crime activities, including La Costa Nostra's influence in narcotics smuggling, stolen heavy equipment, and money laundering. No statistical accomplishments were obtained from this operation. The information received from the operation was already known to the Bureau. Marcello was once involved with illegal gambling, owned a vast amount of real estate, and he often courted politicians. The most interesting development to come out of Camtex was the Bureau's changing attitude towards Marcello. When it was reported to agents that Marcello bragged he was using his political influence to quash an upcoming indictment against Louisiana Governor Edwin Edwards, the Bureau remarked that, quote, there have been no indication whatsoever of organized crime or Marcello's involvement. Marcello's claim that he, quote, set the whole thing up is believed to be puffing, done to impress the listener, which is a trait Marcello has exhibited in the past. New Orleans places no credence on Marcello's statements pertaining to trying to get Senator Russell Long to get Edwards' indictment stopped. When analyzed in concert, the FBI's investigations of Joseph Pareto, Nofio Pecora, and Carlos Marcello during the 1960s to the 1980s shows an organization that's not at its zenith, but rather in steep decline. The FBI squandered manpower and other resources in its intelligence gathering concerning organized crime in New Orleans. While obtaining intelligence to the contrary, the Bureau continued to approach the mafia in New Orleans as a highly structured top-down organization. The Bureau's embrace of the Cressy model left agents doubling down on their efforts to identify structures of an organization that didn't exist. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Dexter. I will now introduce Michael Wynne. And before I do that, again, remind people that they now have questions or comments stimulated by Dexter's presentation. Please post them in the chat feature or the chat function, and we will discuss them at the end of the presentations and my brief comments. Okay. Michael Wynne received a bachelor's in history from Louisiana State University in 1979. He has served for 38 years as a Louisiana State probation and parole officer, and for the last 5 years has been district administrator for 6 parish offices in that system. While his profession has been probation and parole, his avocation has been history, especially that with a local flavor. He is a regular contributor of history-related columns and feature stories for publications and media outlets throughout central Louisiana. He is active in numerous historical organizations and served as vice chairman of the Louisiana Statehood Bicentennial Commission. His presentation this afternoon is on the M.L. Clark Circus. Okay, Michael, you're up.
Well, welcome. It's a great pleasure to speak before LHA today. And I think you'll enjoy this very interesting story that, as far as I know, never been researched before. It's about the M.L. Clark Circus. Although the earliest modern day circuses date back to the late 18th century in England, circuses reached their peak in popularity in the late 19th and early 20th century in America. At that time, there may have been over 100 different circuses traveling around North America, providing entertainment to rural and urban dwellers, as well as to the poor and rich alike, for as little as a nickel for admission. Although many circuses were famous to attendees at that time, it seems as though only the Barnum and Bailey Circus survives now in our current memory, mostly due to their business having survived in one fashion or another all the way to the 21st century. But in its time, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the M.L. Clark Circus, under various names, was well known around North America and was known as the biggest little circus in the world. Scant memories of this great circus even still survive today. 2 brothers, Wiley C. Clark, W.C., and Mac Lauren Clark, M.L. Clark, founded one of the earliest traveling circuses in America in 1883. Until 1892, the original Clark Brothers Circus toured throughout the western, central, and southern states as one of the first and largest mud shows in the country. A mud show circus is one that travels in wagons on the muddy roads from town to town versus a show that travels on a train. The original Clark Brothers Circus dissolved in 1892. The older brother, Wiley, completely left show business by the late 1890s and purchased a hotel in the town of Atoka in the then Indian Territory of Oklahoma just before his death in 1899. But Wiley's younger brother, Mac Lauren, ML as we'll call him here, continued the old mud show tradition by operating a very successful circus under several names, such as the M.L. Clark and Sons combined shows, all the way to 1930. Even after Mac's son, Lee Clark, sold the show to E.E. Coleman in 1930, the Clark name and many Clark descendants continued to have an important presence in American circus history. Descendants of the original Circus Clarks are still performing under the big top. Thus, the Clark family name has been associated with American circuses and the Wild West shows for more than 125 years. It all started with Wiley Clark, who was running a traveling medicine show about 1880 in the South. His medicine show then had a ventriloquist, a magic demonstrations, minstrel acts, and puppet shows. In an early Alexandria, Louisiana newspaper article of November 2nd, 1884, the newspaper announced that the circus would be arriving on November 10th and would include a ventriloquist, comedians, a banjoist, a quote, aged Negro impersonator, quote, and eccentric songs and dances, an aerial performer, a comic vocalist, and, quote, the great Leo, a female impersonator. A balloon ascension demonstration along with an old doctor who pulled teeth at the circus was later added. But in 1886, the balloon ascension demonstration ended when the pilot fell out of the balloon and died. M.L. Clark joined his brother Wiley in 1884. Up until that time, M.L. worked hauling lumber with his own wagon. Wiley needed an extra wagon for his acts, and their joining forces worked to their mutual benefit. After the brothers' breakup, M.L.'s first big act was Empress, the elephant. When he bought the elephant for a very low fee, the prior owner did not tell M.L. that Empress had killed 4 people already. M.L. soon sold Empress in the 1890s to another circus without telling what happened. Empress then killed the new owner by stomping him to death. The owner's wife had Empress brought into the swamp and shot to death. For additional vengeance, she had her roustabouts cut off pieces of the elephant's skin to sell as souvenirs to the circus attendees. The usual routine on how the circus was set up was repeated in each town the circus had on its schedule. An advance man arrived in the town about a week to 2 weeks prior to the circus's arrival. While there, he hung up posters around town and paid for newspaper advertisements in the daily or weekly papers. Additionally, he made arrangements for a street parade to be permitted on the day the circus was to arrive. The advance man also rented, often for the cost of a few tickets, a field on the outskirts of town and made arrangements for some of the higher-end circus staff to have lodging in town, while the rest slept in their wagons. On the day of the circus's arrival, a parade of the wagons would travel through downtown in midday with the animals in their cages in good view of the town inhabitants, as well as performers doing little performances along the parade route. 2 large tents would be set up in the rented field by the circus roustabouts with local unemployed men hired to assist. One tent, usually the larger one, was for the main acts, while the other tent held side shows. 2 performances were traditionally held, one in the afternoon and one in the evening. The circus would leave town the next day. Typical performers of the 1880s and early 1890s in the main tent were jugglers, contortionists, balancing acts on the slack wire, trained dogs and ponies, acrobats, cyclists, and acrobats walking on a rolling globe. Also in the main tent was an 8-piece band. The sideshow consisted of the unusual, including snake wrestlers, ventriloquists, fire eaters, strongmen, and fat and hairy ladies, believe it or not. The peak of the M.L. Clark show was about 1908. At that time, Clark had 12 cages of large animals, 60 wagons, 200 horses, and nearly as many mules, both used for pulling the wagons. He had 6 elephants and 2 giant tents. I will read now a 1906 advertisement published in newspapers that filled up most of the page. And it said, in part, circus, museum, colossal menagerie, and Royal Roman Hippodrome, highest class circus in the world, magnificent in conception, omnipotent in strength, honorably conducted, truthfully advertised. The Circus of 100 Wonders, magnificent exhibition of exclusive high-class features, a monster assembly of rare daredevil and death-defying acts, an imperial collection of rare wild beasts, the most notable of trained and untamable savage man-eating monsters ever seen in this country. 300 people and horses, 300. A herd of monster-trained pachyderms, a drove of camels and lead animals, gorgeous, magnificent. Free street parade, a tremendous exhibition of wealth and splendor, a cool $100,000 in property and stock paraded daily. The list of performers is long and varied and includes famous male and female artists, renowned clowns and jesters, intrepid aerialists, noted strong men and women in Herculean feats of strength, Russian roller skaters, French lady acrobats, phenomenal gymnasts, champion leapers and tumblers, tiny, daring child artists, and a wonderful troupe of trick dogs and ponies, innumerable notable features and astonishing athletic marvels that bewilder their beholders, a herd of monster elephants and camels, dens of wild and ferocious beasts, birds and other creatures of the jungle, and it goes on. Mud shows like the M.L. Clark Circus were very susceptible to the weather. So in the winter months, the Clark Show, like all circuses, quartered in a southern town. M.L. Clark chose Alexandria, Louisiana, a city located in the central part of the state. He bought 995 acres just outside of the main part of town for $1,200 along what would become the northern end of Monroe Street there. He built barns and living quarters, both for his animals and for the circus performers. Nearby Bayou Robert was available for water, and there was also a nearby railroad line and Union Station for bringing in needed supplies. In an Alexandria newspaper article from February 1903, a reporter wrote a lengthy description of the circus grounds, of which the following is an excerpt. It is not necessary for us to tell you who the proprietor and manager of this grand congress of amusement enterprises is, for Mr. Clark is too well known to all the people of Alexandria. We have seen Clark's show grown year by year until he now owns the largest wagon show in America. We first arrived in the quarters as termed by the circus folk. We were shown the stable where the ring stock was kept and groomed. Here we found 40 as fine horses as we ever saw, all professionally known as spots. Then comes the draft horses, 20 big dying dapple grays, as big and round as butterballs. From here, we were taken to an open lot where we find about 75 head of mules that are used in hauling the freight over the roads from one town to another. We were taken to the ring barn where we found a regular zoo of wild animals of almost every description. We must mention in particular the handsome pair of lions that travel with the show. And we must also mention that Mina, the elephant, is the most kindness and playful animal ever seen and is a favorite with all connected with the show. There are hyenas, wildcats, wild boars, camels, kangaroos, bears, tropical birds, 3 or 4 cages of monkeys, and numerous other animals which space will not permit us to mention. It has been necessary to keep a hot fire in the building where the animals are quartered ever since the arrival of the show, as most wild animals cannot stand cold weather. We were also shown a troupe of performing ponies, which were all sizes, some not larger than a good-sized dog. From here, we were shown the rolling stock. We found 45 wagons and cages of every description, undergoing repairs of all kinds. On one side, you hear the anvil ringing. On the other, the carpenter's hammer. And then there are painters, sign writers, decorators, tent makers, and working men of every description, working hard to get ready for the show to cover a route of about 3,000 miles, which is quite a distance for a wagon show to make. End of article. There were future celebrities also connected with the circus. Tom Mix, who died in 1940, made 291 mostly silent movies during his lifetime. In 1910, he worked for this circus as a livestock hostler, roustabout, and performer. Musician Harry James' early years were spent at the circus. His father was a musician for the circus band, and his mother was an acrobat. His grandfather was a one-time director of the circus band. Not surprisingly, there were many strange happenings connected to the circus, with a lot of unsavory characters, too many to talk about here, but just to note a few. In 1890, Sam Cleveland, a Negro minister performer at the circus, robbed a U.S. mail train between his performances. He was arrested by the U.S. Marshals during his latter performance. In 1893, in Indian Territory in Oklahoma, the Cook outlaw gang attempted to rob the circus. A young Clark girl took the circus's strongbox with money and hid it in the cornfield. Belle Starr, a member of the gang, was talked out of trying to go after the strongbox, and the gang left. In 1893, W.A. Barker was a one-time ringmaster of the circus. M.L. Clark didn't pay his circus bills, and a constable came to the circus with an attachment order, basically a warrant. Barker, who was drunk, beat up the constable with a club and shot him. The constable shot back and killed Barker. In 1895, a Clark circus poster scared a horse so much that while he was pulling a wagon with a family aboard, that it caused the wagon to almost go over the side of a bridge. The local newspaper started a campaign to outlaw circus posters and for them to be less thrilling and exciting to look at. In 1897, the circus woman snake charmer, Nellie Reno, was bit by one of her pet rattlers. After 2 days of suffering, her husband was arrested and was going to be lynched for his forcing her to handle snakes. In her dying declaration, she forgave her husband and he was released. This last story will add a little humor to the life of the circus. A new horse was attached to a wagon to pull the wagon, but the horse refused to move. Finally, after trying everything else, the circus horse handler literally built a fire under the horse. When the fire started getting big and the horse was feeling the heat, the horse simply moved 6 feet forward, so the wagon that was tied to him was now over the fire. The wagon caught fire and burned. It took at least 125 pounds of meat a day to feed the flesh-eating animals at the circus, including lions, tigers, bears, hyenas, and others. Disabled and old horses and other animals were bought locally to feed those animals. In Alexandria, the winter quarters, a large elephant graveyard was created off of Monroe Street with the carcasses of literally thousands of animals who were either had performed at the circus or were purchased to feed the animals were buried. Mrs. Clark had initially tried to raise her family in one of the circus barns. She got very tired of this, so according to a February 1907 newspaper article, Mrs. Clark ordered a ready-made house made up of 5 rooms from Chicago and shipped it to Alexandria by rail. The house was put together by her workers with wooden pins and no nails used. The rooms came in sections and the walls locked together at the corners. It took less than 2 days to assemble. This house, sadly no longer in existence, may have been the first documented prefab house in the state of Louisiana. The most famous animal with the M.L. Clark Circus was an elephant called Old Ned. Born in 1894 in Thailand, he was imported to New York in 1901. Allegedly, he was first purchased by another circus for $50,000. He was bought by Clark in 1903. In 1913, in Juarez, Mexico, Clark contracted with a rich Mexican to use Old Ned, the elephant, to fight 5 bulls for $2,500. Old Ned killed or scared off the 5 bulls, and the owner of the bulls was incensed and embarrassed and had Old Ned arrested. M.L. Clark that night broke out Old Ned and sneaked him across the Mexican line back into the United States. Old Ned was declared by Clark to be the largest performing elephant in the world, as compared with Barnum and Bailey's famous elephant, Jumbo. His tusks were reportedly bigger than a large man's legs. M.L. Clark died suddenly in 1926, and his 2 sons took over the circus, but by this time, the circus was ailing due to financial problems, as well as mud shows being obsolete in the days of increasing modern highways. In 1930, the circus was sold to another entrepreneur and continued to limp on until it was completely dissolved in 1945. The legacy of the M.L. Clark Circus was bringing joy, wonder, and excitement to both children and adults alike in a world prior to radio and television. And for those who are more interested in more information about the circus, I published a book on it, and you may find coffee cups around the world with the M.L. Clark logo. Thank you for allowing me to give this presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael. And I will now provide a few comments. And I have a question or two for both of the presenters, and then we'll go to the chat function and see what questions have been submitted by those who are participating. As to my commentary, initially I was somewhat baffled by the prospect of finding a common theme within these presentations. I soon realized, however, that I was overthinking the challenge. Commonality was really evident, and that commonality was entertainment. Both Carlos Marcello and M.L. Clark were entertainment entrepreneurs, legally or illegally. Their enterprises are now truly subject of historic interest. For Marcello, the enterprise changed through legislative fiat from illegal gambling to legalized gaming, and became a venue of government financial support. In other words, the politicians co-opted his success. M.L. Clark's enterprise, on the other hand, fell victim to advances in transportation and communication technology. The circus became, for want of a better description, an entertainment fossil. Now, I must say that I also, in regard to Mr. Babin's presentation, was really struck by the start of the title is Mobster Emeritus. And I found that rather interesting as someone who has had that, appellation stuck to my name since I've retired, and I had never really thought of it being used in that type of a venue, and I found it somewhat amusing. Okay, Mr. Babin, have a question for you. Your paper indicates that the FBI's investigations of Carlos Marcello's New Orleans-based activities were largely fruitless because they could not find a Cressy model of structured organized crime. Was it the failure of Marcello to develop this organized criminal structure, or did he rather focus on developing a monopoly of gambling and associated money laundering that the FBI simply failed to recognize as an organized structure?
Oh, let me start my video. Okay. Well, first, I can't take credit for the mobster emeritus term. That was actually Governor McKeithen called Marcello that during an investigation in the 70s. But kind of branching off from your point you made earlier, I would argue that there was no organized crime really to develop in New Orleans. I think that the political machines controlled vice more so than any mafia organization. And Marcello was just a cog in that larger machine. And once these reform movements kind of started with after Robert Maestry's mayoralship, that Marcello was just the last one to survive all that. You know, Hugh Long was assassinated, Earl Long went to jail and eventually passed away. Robert Maestry walked away from public life. And really, there was no really any kind of monopoly on gambling in Louisiana until I believe that Frank Costello, there's no hard direct evidence, but I believe Frank Costello and Huey Long made a deal to bring slot machines from New York. And I think that tracks because there's an FBI memo observing a meeting between Costello, Dandy Phil Castile, who moved from New York to New Orleans, and between Earl Long and Robert Maestry. And if there was a mafia organization in New Orleans, then why wasn't anyone from this mafia organization in on that meeting? It was between the New York mobsters and the Long machine. So that was really, I think, who was in control of Vice. It was just Marcello who was a cog in that, and just happened to survive. So I hope that answers your question. I think I complicated it with like 500 more questions with that.
Okay, that's quite all right, and that will stimulate some more chat. For Mr. Wynne, I have a question for you, or I have a couple of questions for you. In your presentation, you cite a local newspaper article from 1903 that provides a description of the winter quarters of the M.L. Clark Circus. Do you know when the circus began to winter in Alexandria, and did this practice continue beyond the death of M.L. Clark in 1926?
Originally, the earliest evidence I found that the Clarks were starting to use Alexandria as their winter home was around 1891, where they rented land. Eventually, ML would buy land off of Monroe Street, which is a very old street that goes off of downtown here in Alexandria, and would start building barns and establishing the circus. But I think they first wintered there, from what I've been able to find in newspapers, in the fall of 1891, and they continued wintering there all the way up until when the circus was sold in 1930 by the family to a Mr. E. Coleman of Cincinnati, Ohio.
Okay, thank you. Now I have, I guess, a two-part question that kind of goes along with that.
I'll do the best.
Is there any extant physical evidence of this wintering in Alexandria? And then the second part, have you found any reflection of this wintering out at the end of Monroe Street in any of the Sanborn maps of Alexandria?
I'm glad you asked that question. And it's really, in a way, sort of a single question there. I have found a lot of evidence. I've been able to get the property deeds. The Sanborn maps reflect this. But when they show the Sanborn maps in this area, when he bought this land at the end of Monroe Street, which is actually a very busy area now, but it back then was the woods, it just shows a big open area where he bought the land. There was no streets or anything else like that. He bought basically fields or cut fields. He asked for evidence. The newspaper articles have been extremely helpful on M.L. Clark's history. There's property deeds and other documents still at the Rapides Parish Courthouse where Alexandria is located at. And one of the most interesting survivals is the elephant graveyard. Now, actually, until I started researching, the location had been long forgotten. The son of M.L. Clark, Lee Clark, in 1965, gave an in-depth interview with the local paper in Alexandria called the Town Talk, and talked about the elephant graveyard. And the Town Talk reporter took a picture of the site off of Monroe Street. And I took this picture because it didn't say exactly the address. And I took this picture, and after quite a bit of walking the area, I was able to match the picture from the Town Talk in 1965 of the elephant graveyard, which was, even in 1965, was still an empty lot, and found it. And there are now houses located on it. And supposedly thousands of animals' carcasses were buried there. So in a way, there is additional legacy with the graveyard that sadly the people don't really know about. But the Clark family home is still surviving, but on Monroe Street, not the one that was a prefab house that was torn down, but their second home is still surviving, but heavily modified and currently abandoned. But that's really about it. The train track's gone, the train station gone. None of the original buildings still survive.
Okay, I will turn to the chat feature, and we have a question here for Mr. Wynne. Did the circus feature any strongman, magic acts, or more objectionable acts like freak shows as some other circuses did?
Absolutely, positively. I think towards the beginning of my talk, I talked about the sideshows. They had a sideshow that had a hairy lady and a fat lady. They did have freak shows of this kind of sort, of odd people, dwarfs, and everything. It wouldn't happen today, but it was of the times, and most circuses were doing something of that nature if they could find it. Of course, General Tom Thumb was one of the most famous. Of course, he was tied with the P.T. Barnum circus, but all circuses had their freak shows to try to bring people into the main tent for the regular shows, the paid tickets for the regular shows. The side shows were often free. It was a way of getting people to pay for tickets to go into the main tent. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, okay. We actually have a question to you, Mr. Wynne, from your fellow presenter, Dexter Babin. He says, do we know what was on the circus poster that frightened a horse to the point that it ran off a cliff, or almost ran off a cliff?
I appreciate Dexter asking that. I had a PowerPoint, but due to we had problems trying to pull it up and show it, but the posters for the M.L. Clark Circus are absolutely some of the finest artwork. I actually think better artwork. I compared them to the P.T. Barnum and Bailey Circus and other such circuses. The Clark artwork was the most dazzling, and the lion poster and the bear poster, where they're gives the appearance of attacking a human being, and they're monstrous size. I could imagine that it would scare a horse. We don't know the exact poster that scared the horse, and that occurred actually in Ruston, Louisiana. We don't know the exact poster. You can see online many of the posters in my book, and I'm not trying to sell my book, but in my book, I have been able to reproduce about 20 of the posters, and they're just absolutely dazzling. And I recommend that everybody who's interested in circuses look at the M.L. Clark posters online.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions coming through on the chat? I don't see anything else. While we're waiting to see if anybody else comes in with a question. A comment from Stephen. I don't know the last name here showing up, but comic book historians have noted that the costumes of strongmen inspired outfits of numerous superheroes, including characters like Superman. Huh. Okay. Let me take this opportunity. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean I'm sorry to interrupt. I do agree with that comment. I think, in fact, I didn't realize that until that was brought up, and I think that's a very astute comment. And that's all I want to say.
Okay, while we're waiting to see if anything else comes in, I want to remind you to join us again next week on Thursday, February the 23rd at 5:30 in the afternoon for the 4th online session, War and Tragedy in New Orleans. Okay, James, it kind of looks like we're about done. Do you?
Well, thank you to the presenters, and thank you to everyone that tuned in today. It's been a great session, and thank you, Brady, for hosting. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Everyone have a wonderful evening.